Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. I know some people are still making their way in the room, but I'm going to go ahead and get started with just a few housekeeping announcements before I pass things over to our panel this morning. I want to say welcome to all of you who are here in the room with us, and welcome also to our virtual attendees who are joining through the live stream. I'm Leah Hines. I'm the Executive Director for the Charleston Conference, the Charleston Hub, and I'm so glad that all of you are here today. I have two important corrections. If you are using the print program, this is correct on our event site. If you're using the app, no problems there. But if you were looking at the print program, the Charleston premieres, the time is 5:15 to 6:15 today. So the time is listed incorrectly in the print. And the Long Arm of the Law session tomorrow will be held in the Carolina Ballroom of the Francis Marion Hotel. All of our sessions are at the Francis Marion Hotel tomorrow. So please make those notes in the print program if you are using that one. Also, if you are attending the dine-arounds tonight, please RSVP, reply to that confirmation email, let them know that you're coming, confirm by 3 p.m. today so that they can confirm those head counts with the restaurants. Don Hawkins is in the audience. He is our conference blogger, so if you stay up to date with all of the news and happenings for the conference by visiting his blog. And I'd like to once again say thank you to our 2022 conference sponsors. We could not do this without your support and your help, so let's give a round of applause for all of our sponsors, please. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn things over to Heather Staines, one of our conference directors, to introduce the panel. Thank you, Heather.
Thanks, Leah. Good morning, everyone. I hope your conference is going as well as mine is. I'm so excited to be able to look out and see all of you here today. As Leah said, I've been involved with the conception of this panel, and I couldn't be more thrilled to see how it's come together. I will be introducing the moderator, which I always forget to introduce myself. In addition to being a conference director, senior strategy consultant at Delta Think, and I've been coming to Charleston since 2006. My colleague, Lori Carlin, will be moderating the session today. Lori is the Chief Commercial Officer at Delta Think, where she's responsible for business development, new business opportunities and partnerships, as well as corporate training, marketing, and communications for Delta Think. Prior to joining Delta Think in 2013, she held senior positions in publishing and membership management at the American Institute of Physics, American Thoracic Society, and Society of Nuclear Medicine. She's also very active in the publishing industry, serving as the current SSP annual meeting co-chair, former SSP board member, and many other roles at SSP. She's a frequent speaker at industry events. So with that, I will hand over to Lori, who will introduce the rest of our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. And yeah, I guess you're going to hear that all week. We're so happy to be here in person, seeing everyone, and feels like old times. This is probably my 10th or 12th Charleston, I can't remember, but it's great to be back, right? It's a special year. We have 3 speakers today who are going to be talking about DEI and data analytics and evidence and how they've collected it and how they're using it to support their activities and programs. Very broad and diverse perspectives you're going to hear from our 3 speakers. Robin Price. Robin's the Bibliometrics Manager at Imperial College London, and Robin previously worked in the editorial teams on open access and subscription journals at Sage. Also speaking today is Beth Blanton, Director of Collections, University of Virginia Libraries, and she leads the team responsible for collections development and management strategies for all types of materials within the libraries. And then Gwen Evans will close out our formal speaking session, part of the session. She's the VP of Global Library Relations at Elsevier, and she was previously the Executive Director at OhioLink, which many of you know, the consortium for academic libraries in Ohio. So we will leave plenty of time for questions, and we look forward to a lively discussion after the presentation. So thank you all, and I will turn it over to Robin to start us off.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So, as introduced, my name is Robin, and I work at Imperial College London, which is a research-intensive, science-focused institution in the UK. And I'm going to update you on a project we've been running at the college to investigate whether there is a role for data in helping our course instructors understand whether there might be forms of what we're terming geographic bias in their selection and curation of text for reading lists. So, this project began when a colleague at the School of Public Health at the college took over management of a master's course. This is my colleague, Dr. Matthew Harris, and he wanted to start the term with this new direction of the master's course on prompting his colleagues, the other instructors of modules within that course, to prompting them to reflect on whether there might be overvaluations or undervaluations of types of research or research that comes from different regions when they are selecting which kind of courses, which kind of topics and which reading material go into courses. So he began with going out and speaking to these colleagues, and some of the responses that he got are responses that you can see up on the slide. So something like, when I first started teaching at Imperial, there was almost a sense of, we're scientists, we deal in objective facts, we're not biased, we deal in merit. So you can see there's a kind of resistance to thinking that there could be a kind of lack of objectivity, or in fact bias, whether that would then be unconscious bias in selecting texts. And this is something that anecdotally I have also seen in science research, looking at the literature, looking within science faculties of, and something that you might have experienced as well, of a kind of perception that a lot of what in the UK would be called decolonizing the curriculum is perhaps not applicable in science research, that that's a social science or a humanities issue. And this is something that we so wanted to try and grapple with, and we wondered how can we encourage and support STEM faculty to begin to ponder their own, examine their own unconscious biases. And the types of bias that we were thinking of that perhaps might exist is what you see here in the figure, what we're using by the term heuristics, so thinking about when your mind, based on your experience, makes connections between concepts. So for some of us in the room, many of us, depending on entirely your experience and the education system that you grew up in, that you think of high quality research, and it's quite reasonable that your mind makes a leap, an association, that fast thinking to then thinking that high quality research, especially science, high quality research would come from a place with increased scientific capacity, resource intensive science research. When you think of where has increased scientific capacity to fund that research, you think of high-income countries. You might very well then have many ideas of high-income countries. So in this slide example, the US. And then based on all of the reputations that exist within that country of institutions, that many of our own institutions benefit from these reputations of privilege, naturally, certain institutions come to your mind as well. I mean, this is, I think, quite a reasonable cycle that many of our minds make of unconscious biases when you are looking at perhaps an abstract and your eye glances over the affiliation of the author and you, in a microsecond, decide whether or not this abstract is worth reading your time. I think this is very common that these biases do exist. But what about when this problem then starts when you perhaps reverse the cycle and your mind sees an affiliation like the one in the example here, Harvard University, and you reverse it and you automatically think that this paper is high quality research, or even more dangerous, when we kind of flip this and you think of low quality research, the type of institutions that then when you see this in an affiliation, your mind might be making unconscious biases, bringing in all of these other pieces of experience, whether that is true or false, against that abstract and those affiliated authors before you've even read the paper. So these are the kind of geographic bias framework that we wanted to explore with course instructors and felt like that a data approach would be a way that they as STEM faculty would respond to. So we devised a tool that goes into our reading list management system, which is Leganto, and it can pick up every single journal article item for every module of every year that it has been taught since 2015. And in that citation item, it picks up each of the author affiliations. So in this example of this one item from one course, there are 4 authors. The method then takes the author field, as many times as there are fields for as many authors as there are, and picks it up from Leganto and takes it through a bibliographic database. The one that our model uses is the Web of Science. Here then it retrieves the country affiliations, because that is not something that we have in our Leganto database. So we've picked up the author country affiliations. In this example, there are 4 country affiliation fields representing 3 countries: UK, USA, Singapore, and the USA repeated for these 4 authors in this example citation. Our method then takes the country fields through the World Bank has a GNI, Gross National Income Per Capita Atlas ranking. It's a percentile. We are then taking the author country positions from that Atlas ranking, and it devises a calculation. So we end up with a figure that is a weighted average for the author countries and the GNI per capita status of those countries. And the calculation is described as below. So we'd have in this example, in the numerator, is 170, 194, 190, and 194. That's because in this example, those are the 4 GNI per capita positions of the countries, of the authors. And in the denominator, that figure 203, that is a fixed figure because that is the maximum number of countries that are in this GNI per capita ranking. And then it is multiplied within the denominator by the number of author countries that have been found. So an item isn't advantaged or disadvantaged by having just one author or many authors. So we've tried to sort of keep it, you get this sense of proportion of where the author countries are and that GNI per capita ranking. So we then built this into a dashboard interface. It runs through Power BI, which is a data visualization front-end tool that we use at the college, so that we could then take course instructors and show them representations of the data. So for example, they might be able to see this is 2 related modules within one course, and we could demonstrate to them, in this example, here is the countries that are displayed, so where there is a blue dot that indicates that an author country has been found on your reading list. You can look at that score that we've devised, if they want to look at that score, if that kind of evidence-based data point is of interest to them, and then we'd help contextualize that. So whilst the score actually doesn't mean anything as a number in isolation, you could think that the way that it works would be that the closer it is to 1, that indicates more high-income countries are cited on the reading list, and the closest possible score to 1 would be an article that exclusively has authors from the top GNI per capita ranked country in that index, which would be Liechtenstein. And then the closer that the score is to 0 would be the more low-income countries, low GNI per capita countries that are represented in the World Bank Atlas ranking. And so the closest to 0 possible score that a paper could have would be authors exclusively from Burundi. So with that kind of context, it could help instructors get a visualization when it is aggregated as to all of the papers that they are citing in their reading list, We could then make an aggregate score of that so that they could, if they wanted to, for example, look at parallel courses, related courses, and see the differences between what they're teaching, obviously with the course expert contextualization of that. And then this then is something we would provide to course instructors if they then want to use this as an indicator as to whether there are other decolonization or equality, diversity, inclusion efforts, their own reflections on reading lists, if they wish to have that to chart progress or to be able to begin those conversations with data points. There are limitations to this, the way that we've run it. The articles, unfortunately, all we can pick up through the Web of Science. We haven't been able to make it work for books, which is a substantial limitation for undergraduate teaching. And it has to come from data that's come from our own reading list system. Obviously, really not unaware of the inherent tensions of using tools like the Web of Science or the World Bank in a decolonization project, and with those limitations of the journal articles and the fact that neither of those two sources are unbiased, and the Web of Science is not a comprehensive database. If anybody here is working with databases and could help us, that we'd be really interested to do so. We have really rich discussions with our course instructors that we show this data to, and much of the feedback is that we would really like to investigate if this data would be meaningful looking at other types of characteristics or demographics of authors, because obviously the country that you're affiliated to at the time of publishing is just one very limited indicator of an author's identity. When we do these workshops with staff, we can have a 2-3 hour workshop where we can end up with the most fascinating and interesting discussions with staff, and many of the times the conversation comes back to the fact that they are operating within the limits of the global research economy, and in many cases, things like it needs contextualizing. High power, high energy physics is only going to occur in countries that have the resources to run high energy physics programs. But there is a lot to dismantle and unpack, despite thinking about some of those limitations like these systems of privileged journal publishing, English as the global language of science. All of those are really rich discussions we've had with staff based out of showing them this data. And what we're really conscious of is that metrics should not become goals. That any idea of gaming metrics, of not using these data points meaningfully, we would strongly not want to start encouraging that. And so that's why we've taken a very personalized approach with showing this data to individual course instructors who've said that they are interested to do so. So it really leaves me with wondering whether there is a place for quantitative data in these really complex decolonization, DEI projects that we, as the library or information sector, might take on with our faculty partners. And the framing thought that for me has been so valuable is from a colleague in the UK, Elizabeth Charles. And she says, the aim is not to tell academics what should be included on their reading lists, but to make visible the lack of other voices. And that is what we have attempted with this data as a point of evidence to start making visible that lack of other voices that might be present on reading lists. And this is within a context that for many science faculty members, data is a place that they expect to start understanding from and expect to see as we go along this journey. And that ultimately this data is only descriptive. There can only tell you what the reading list currently looks like and not at all what it should look like. But we hope that by presenting these conversations with staff that they can begin to unpick some of those biases that we might have seen at the beginning, those ideas that I am objective and I'm not biased because I'm a scientist. Instead, start thinking past those unconscious biases. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. That was really interesting, and I'm looking forward to incorporating your ideas at my library. It's great to see all you today. When I first got to the center, my primary goal was to speak coherently in front of you. Now it's not to fall off the stage or knock any of my colleagues off. So, Gwen, if I disappear, carry on. I expect many of you have been faced by a conundrum I face on a regular basis. Someone comes to me and says, "You described to me how the print collection provides value and contributes to the success of my students and faculty. Not only that, but they want to know how library resources are used by faculty in anthropology or graduate students in material science engineering or undergraduate majors in American studies." Often I find myself in the position of saying, I have circulation data, I have stories, and then I have a blank face from the person who answers me the question. So over the past several years, I went to our wonderful technology initiatives colleagues at the library and asked them to help me create a tool that would help me see a complete picture of print collection use. And then several years ago, the library and the university embarked on an institution-wide implementation of the Inclusive Excellence Framework to synergize and support our collective diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. From a collections perspective, understanding our print collections and their use became even more important. And I give a shout out of thanks to my wonderful colleague, Robin Regato, who shepherded this process from concept to implementation. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this Peter Drucker aphorism, and I agree to some extent. But as librarians, we often tend to be about relationships. And so how do we take the data and then put that together with the stories to tell the to paint a complete picture of circulation use? As libraries and librarians, we're very good at collecting data, but it's often in disparate systems and very difficult to manage together. And so what we wanted to do was to create a tool that would help not only, collections, but our liaison outreach, teaching and learning folks, and service development and implementation strategies. At UVA, we wanted to create a longitudinal data set which would allow us to look at short and longer-term trends to support that effort. In addition, and not surprisingly, we collect very heavily in the Western canon and from preeminent publishers. As we began to look at these areas where we needed to apply efforts to decolonize our collection, we envisioned this tool as a key part of the process. Now, just to make things more interesting, at the time we were developing this tool, the university at large changed its financial responsibility model. As a result, different schools, engineering, architecture, commerce, had to pay for central services, things like HR, IT, and the library. So it's every librarian's dream to be considered a tax, right, on your user population. So as part of this process, we realized we could no longer map Library of Congress headings and classes and subclasses to specific domains, departments, or users. And we needed a tool to help us see the big picture. However, as we began to work on this tool, we hit the pillars of our profession. And we hit many concerns about privacy issues. We wanted a complete picture of collection use, but we did not want to create something that would allow us to identify specific users. We have a lot of data, and some of that data has associated computing IDs and university IDs. And we knew we had to do something about this. We needed to anonymize it as quickly as we could. So, but we also recognize that various constituencies around the library use that same data set to improve services, monitor collections, show value, inform collection development, and this was a surprise to some of my colleagues, validate our user surveys. So, what could we do? Could we identify risk, mitigate it, and then create a data set to inform our processes? So our primary goals were to reduce risk to the user privacy, augment the data, munge it all together in one place, and enable library staff to query the data and then use it for service deployment. Folks have asked, well, what kind of data are you talking about? This, of course, is from our ILS, from Aon, from Archive Space, from various other turnkey systems, as well as the university's enterprise system, to which we had a long desired access to the data. So anonymizing this data allowed us to develop some research plans to create some data-informed approaches to decision-making. And I obviously am speaking from a collections perspective, but this data set is used widely across the library. Now, for those of you who may be graduates of the University of Virginia or have been associated with it, please excuse my pun. The university, when it was first formed by Mr. Jefferson, was known as the Academical Village. But the point of this slide is to let you know that this wasn't just a library project. We had to collaborate with colleagues from across the university to make this dream a reality. And because we were collaborating with people from across the university, we had to have some very clear objectives in mind. One was to communicate the perceived value of developing the system, ID the specific data that we wanted and where it resided, revise our retention and archiving schedules, provide de-identification of users with a unique key. In our case, we use a salted hash. If you take me out for a glass of wine, I'll tell you how that works. And then we had to secure the data, but make it accessible to library staff. And this may seem easy, but the reason for doing so is that some of this data, once we got it and archived it, it disappeared from the other systems. So if we ever wanted to go back and reconstruct it, we had to have a plan in place to do that. So ultimately, our goal was to create a data set that would allow us to search, mine, and extract the necessary data, and to have a robust technical structure behind it that took into account all of the various abilities and capabilities of our technology services. We identified 3 primary stakeholder groups within the library: my team, collection management, library assessment, and the liaisons and teaching and learning teams. But we discovered that we had many goals in common. So for some specific examples of how we have used this data set, remember I mentioned being a tax earlier? So we had some administrators in a particular school that said, my folks don't use the library. It's all on the web anyway. I hope you all laughed at that internally at any rate. And so we were able to go to this data set and give this person a 10-year snapshot of how use happens with the print collection by their faculty, their graduate students, and their undergraduates. I think that was an eye-opener for this administrator who really had no idea that this was going on. As a matter of fact, we were able to drill down and say, give specific examples of library classes and subclasses where use was happening. In the education school, we have a unique children's literature pandemic collection, which focuses on social and emotional learning. When we wanted to look at how that was being used, much to our surprise, we discovered the use is not confined to the teachers in training in the education school, but in fact was used widely across the university community. These are great books. So I encourage you to look at our collection on our website. They're fascinating. So the result is that what we were able to do is take this data and find the right people to whom we needed to talk when we wanted to make changes either to our collecting plans, what we keep on site in our libraries, and where we need and recognize that we need to make changes to our collection development plans. I would also mention, and everyone, I don't know if you have this experience at your institution, but you do a user survey and you get back some fascinating information. But then when you pull up the data, they don't always match. So this is we found this tool to be quite helpful in helping us to figure out a better way based on just anecdotes or just data. So we were able to prove value we are able to prove value at the departmental and individual level using this tool. About 6 months ago, we decided we wanted to redo our Arabic language plans, and we thought we had identified the appropriate department, faculty, and graduate students to whom we wished to speak about it. But using this tool, we discovered that the heaviest users in our institution was the School of Continuing and Professional Studies. We would never have realized that these were folks to whom we needed to speak as we considered revising this plan. Same thing happened when looking at our archaeological materials with the idea of thinking about Indigenous studies. Our archaeology faculty are located in both the anthropology and the art departments. But what we discovered is that most of the use, probably not surprisingly, is coming from the history department and from grad students and not faculty. And just a bit of curiosity, most of the items are checked out between 1 and 2 p.m. I have no idea what that means, but I'm going to figure it out. In addition, we take this data and we use it to help us plan some of our other projects. At UVA, we have, in collections, we have a program that we call Hack the Stacks, where we invite faculty and graduate students, and undergraduates as well, where we can identify intersectional subject areas where we either see high turnover because we don't have many volumes on the subject, or where we think we see emerging studies. So this might be Black men in education, disability studies, Black feminism. These are some of the Hack the Stacks projects that we've used to augment our collections based on the data that we've discovered from the system. Now I know what you're all thinking, because I'm thinking it too. And that is, this is data about the print collection, and it doesn't include our e-resources. And we recognize that and are working on finding a way to integrate the data that we get from our e-vendors with our print collection tool. And we'd be delighted to talk to you if you've got a solution for us. In addition, early into the project, we discovered that using data from the university's enterprise system to fuel our DEI efforts, well, the data was simply wrong in most cases, and we had to scrap that idea. But it is our desire to find a way around that, and rather than inferring from use or taking that usage data and talking directly with our departments, faculty, and students, we are diligently looking for a solution to help us solve that issue. As you can tell, this was a labor of love and a great deal of effort. I believe it took us 16 months to develop this tool, and it took a large number of people from across the library and the university, and I want to give them a shout out of thanks for all they've done. And here's a picture of the beautiful dorm room and the rotunda. One should always think about beautiful libraries that are taxes on their communities of practice. And if you have any questions or ideas or suggestions for us, we'd love to hear from you. There's my email address. Thank you.
Hello all, and thanks for this opportunity to discuss Elsevier's efforts in assessing diversity data at scale in a lot of ways. In contrast, this is at space shuttle level scale, looking down on the research ecosystem. And I'd like to acknowledge that my colleague, Vice President of Research Intelligence, Holly Falk-Krasinski, is our real internal subject matter on this subject. She is here, she's presenting on Friday. If you have more in-depth questions later, I will help you chase her down. So why does equity, there's increasing awareness that equity and diversity in research matters in all kinds of ways. There's the impact on individual researchers and their careers, the identification of truly inclusive research questions within the disciplines, and critically, the effect on the outcomes of research. For example, clinical outcomes and drug development that have an impact at the individual and population level, as well as policy decisions at national and international level, such as the differential impacts of climate change. And everyone in this ecosystem shares the responsibility to accelerate equity within our various sectors. So at Elsevier, we've had a sustained interest in I&D, both internally and externally, with robust executive sponsorship from CEO Kumsal Bayezid. And since 2015, we've produced a number of pro bono analytic research reports on gender. All of the gender reports draw on high-quality data from Scopus and our deep analytics expertise, and they're designed to answer the call for a data-driven approach for addressing gender inequality issues and to serve as vehicles for understanding the role that gender plays within the global research enterprise, specifically with regards to the research workforce. So you can see that QR code will connect you to the page with these research, and I just want to note the methodology for assigning gender in these reports is different from the one that I will discuss later, and you can download the data at Mendeley Data if you want to crunch it in your own way. So another use of publication data at scale is this study to understand the populations and models focused on Alzheimer's disease research, considering both sex and gender analysis, because Alzheimer is a larger burden on, for women. We mined Science Direct article methods sections to identify and categorize studies as research focused on women or females, research focused on men or male subjects, or both. The majority of research focuses on men or male subjects, and exclusively so in almost half. Women or female subjects were mentioned exclusively in just 20%. The difference is most prominent in animal studies. 62% of research using animal models mentions males only, while 14% of research mentions females only. This is a finding with great significance, given that animal models facilitate the discovery of new drug targets, and sex-related factors can influence drug-related responses. And if you want a larger look at the landscape here, I recommend the book Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, by Carolyn Criado Perez for an overview, especially the section on crash test dummies, and I'll just leave that there. So given these contexts, we are expanding efforts to collect self-reported diversity data across our journals in author, editorial, and peer review workflows. And we are now working with the 53 publishers covering 15,000 plus journals in the joint commitment for action on inclusion and diversity in publishing, which is being led by the Royal Society of Chemistry, and expanding what we learned in our Elsevier's initial efforts in self-reported gender identification, expanding it to race and ethnicity data. This is an enormously complex process, and I'm just going to describe a few of the steps and lessons learned. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but the 4 major considerations were the data schemas, the platform, including privacy and legal considerations, communication to ensure transparency and to build trust, and how the data will be reported and displayed. So Elsevier had started with a self-reported gender identity question in our own editorial system, and you can see some of the complexities addressed, not creating only binary options, using specific language about gender identity, not gender, and clear indications about this is a purely voluntary process, and with an explanation about the use of the data and the privacy policy. The display of this anonymized aggregate data is currently displayed on our journal titles, showing the composition of the editorial, the gender breakdown of the editorial board of that particular journal, and benchmarking it against the portfolio of subject journals. Extending the effort to race and ethnicity data is even more complex. The schemas, including census data, are not universal globally. There are much greater legal and policy considerations, and there's much more personal hesitancy to answer compared to gender questions. We worked with Professor Ann Morning, a global census expert consultant and researcher at NYU, and with the Joint Commitment Group. And the intention is not to devise a single objective or prescriptive truth about researchers' race and ethnicity, but a set of options that resonate with our stakeholders who are asking us for this sort of data. And the level of aggregation and number of options we offer to respondents to any survey has to parallel the scale of diversity we can practically accommodate. For example, diversity on editorial boards or as peer reviewers. And this approach ties to both survey and data privacy best practice. We should not capture data that we do not intend to convert to actionable output. And I do want to emphasize over and over, all of this data is anonymous and aggregate and will not be tied to an individual. So the first step was to develop a draft schema and then test it. Questions were developed in an iterative process in consultation with our experts and the Joint Commitment Group. And we used the schema in a large-scale test survey sent to a random selection of active authors pulled from Scopus, which was designed to be publisher agnostic and broadly representative. The test survey represents more than 1,000 responses, and then all parties engaged in an iterative process to refine the schema. Here's the draft schema used in the test survey. You'll note that respondents are able to select all that apply, and for the ethnicity schema, it was determined that a geographical focus was the most appropriate menu of options. Respondents were then asked whether they felt the options represented them well and how comfortable they were in indicating these identities when submitting an article, serving on an editorial board, and serving as a peer reviewer. East and Central Asia and Western Europe were the top 2 selected origins of ethnic origins, and just under half identified as white, and just over 1/3 as Asian or Pacific Islander. The results indicate that the vast majority of respondents were willing to respond when presented with the options provided both for ethnic origins and race. In the case of ethnic origins, even if they didn't feel well represented by the options provided. The reasons people provided for not responding and or not feeling well represented presented us with clear indications and direction on a couple of fronts with regards to refining the schema options and what needs to be addressed in our communication plan in terms of how we all arrived at this global schema. We also learned the percentage of respondents selecting prefer not to disclose was almost double for race compared with ethnic origins or gender identity, demonstrating far greater sensitivity to race data versus the other two categories. Around half of respondents were comfortable indicating their ethnic origins and race in all three categories, but 28 to 32% are not comfortable in each of these three scenarios. The greatest concern, which I don't think will be a surprise, was related to this data introducing bias, prejudice, and discrimination if it were to be made available during the peer review process. Another frequently shared concern was a lack of understanding about why this data is needed. We will need to specifically address this issue in our communication and outreach plans. Western Europe origin versus other ethnic origins overall were more likely to feel well represented in the options, but feel more uncomfortable indicating ethnic origins and race when submitting articles, serving as an editor, or serving as a reviewer. And this is the final joint commitment endorsed gender, race, and ethnicity schema, which will be used to collect this self-reported data. Elsevier has been using it in their editorial workflow system since June. And if we as publishers don't have the data, it's very difficult to understand where we are, to design effective interventions, and set goals and measure progress to increase representation across publishing workflows. And if you want more details, that Nature article goes through a lot of people's efforts and the call from communities and stakeholders for more diversity data in this ecosystem. So I highly recommend reading that Nature article. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was great, wonderful. I will start off with a question, but we will quickly turn over to the audience for your questions. I actually am fascinated by this topic. I've been working with a number of publishers on the publishing side, on assessing their environment and their communities along the lines that Gwen was talking about. And one question I have is about using AI or data collection methods other than self-reporting, and the social implications of that, the ethical implications of that. Have you looked into those for if you're not using that? Is that something that you've investigated, even to just establish benchmarks? And if you are using data collection methods that are not self-reported, have you gotten pushback? What type of social or ethical questions have you had regarding this data and the collection of it? I think that's
So those gender reports are a methodology that relies on inferred gender identity, which is a machine learning process. We used a outside product or a tool called NameSoar, which does this. So it's fuzzy and it's inaccurate, but the level at which you're analyzing gives it some statistical reliability. But again, part of that, the recognition of that, the limitations of that approach led to this effort to enhance it by self-reported data. But I think we all know that algorithms have bias themselves. But again, when you're dealing at this sort of scale, those are your choices. And just again, that iterative process of refining, reviewing, reflecting, looking at the results and saying, oh, that didn't exactly match up to other, other sources of data. I was at a CNI presentation that I thought was really interesting where the chief privacy officer was at UC Berkeley, I think, or UC Davis, UC Berkeley. And he was talking about his privacy concerns with algorithms. And he said, once the data is used to inform the algorithm, you can't get that data back out. It's it's there, you can't undo it. So there are a lot of very complex questions there, and I just think we're all in a process of learning about it in the service of doing better at large amounts of data.
Great. Robin or Beth, anything you want to add about your methods?
So similarly, we, when showing this data to course instructors and also then to committees responsible for the direction of education within their schools or to student groups, we've also been asked for, can you do this for data? They want to see when we do this for gender, they want to see the gender ratios of the authors cited in their reading lists. And for the reasons of the complexity that Gwen has described, we haven't done that, and we don't have gender data available to us without following some of those techniques, which we don't have resources in this project to do. And the point about self-reporting, so we generate this citation source index figure. We can do that for every single course that exists in our Leganto system dating back to 2015. We absolutely could send every single course instructor, this is your score this year, last year, the year before. We could aggregate that at a departmental level, and we have very consciously chosen not to pursue that method, and instead to go away, collect the data. It runs live, and for those who wish to come to the workshops that we hold or to invite us into their research groups or their school education meetings, that then we show it to them and discuss and contextualize it.
Great, great.
I'll just say my perspective is slightly different from a collection development. We don't have perhaps access to quite as sophisticated tools as Elsevier does, but we work with our research data services to try to analyze some of our journal subscriptions or some of our other things that we purchase in order and using inferred gender analysis to make some decisions about this journal or that journal or doing business with a particular vendor, that sort of thing.
Yeah, great.
And I just want to mention that Elsevier runs a free cloud-based computational platform called ICSR Lab, where you can combine your own data with this sort of with Scopus data. You have to bring your own developers or programmers, and you have to apply. But it is a method, if you're interested in combining your own data sets with the publication data sets available, it is possible to do that. So,
Great, Thank you all. Any questions from the
If
audience?
you have a question, just, I've got the microphone. You'll need to come over to here.
Oh,
Yeah. It's just easier if we get people to line up.
yeah, so if you want to line up, if you have questions.
No, that's fine.
I'm Julia Gelfand from the University of California at Irvine, and I have a question for Beth about the UVA experience. Can you tell us what you think this concludes about browsability and the serendipitous discovery of resources? Because now, as we've, many collections are e-preferred, and how do people, you don't go to the stacks and get the most recent output on a topic. It could be a decade old or whatever. And how this all speaks to discoverability and what tools, besides the catalogs, complement that process.
So that is a great question, and hats off to my colleagues. We use Circe Dynex as our ILS, and but we also use Blacklight that runs on top of that, and a solar index to provide access to our collections. And my very brilliant colleagues were able to come up with a way that we, within our ILS, folks can browse by call number, regardless of the format of the material. But you know what the big problem is here, is that not every ebook comes with call number attributions. And that is one of our big challenges, which we are still working on overcoming.
We have another question from the audience.
Hi, y'all. Erin Gallagher, University of Florida. First of all, thank you, panel. This has been really great. My question is specifically for Gwen, actually. You mentioned that you're only collecting data that will lead to, actionable items. I didn't write the exact wording, but what are examples of those actionable items?
So we're talking about three particular workflows, at least initially. We're talking about editorial boards, peer reviewers, and author submissions. And for example, the goal in displaying the gender breakdown on the editorial boards and the benchmark is to have those, again, it's a process of reflection, if your editorial board is skewed one way or the other, and it could be skewed in the other direction too, that having that editorial board have that data and reflect how can we become a better, more diverse editorial board. When you're looking for peer reviewers, if you know that all your peer reviewers come from Harvard, for example, how do you make efforts to increase the diversity of that pool of peer reviewers? So those are the sorts of actionable insights from the publishing point of view. First, you have to know where you are. If you want to go a particular place, you have to know where you are, and then you have to figure out what are the interventions that you need to make to get a more diverse editorial board or peer reviewer pool.
Yeah, absolutely, establishing that baseline so that you can then see where you need to grow and change. We are just at time. Any last questions? Or we can say thank you. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you all.